Dadperfectrevenge. I watched my son-in-law Leonard slip something into my bourbon at my wife's memorial dinner. He smiled at me across the table, that same charming smile that won my daughter's heart 4 years ago. What he didn't know was that the glass he just poisoned wasn't the one I was going to drink. My name is Stanley Morrison. I'm 58 years old. And for the past 4 months, I've been pretending to be a confused old man while watching my family try to steal everything I've worked for. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. Last year, I sold Morrison Manufacturing, the plant I'd supervised for 35 years. We made metal components for construction equipment, brackets, joints, reinforcement pieces. Nothing glamorous, but essential stuff that kept buildings standing and bridges from falling down. Started on the factory floor when I was 18. Worked my way up to plant supervisor by the time I was 30. Spent the next 25 years making sure we delivered quality parts on time, every time. When the national conglomerate made their offer, I walked away with $5.8 million. Not bad for a guy who started with nothing but a willingness to work hard and learn everything about manufacturing precision parts. My wife Dorothy had been gone for 3 years by then. Cancer took her in 2021, and without her, that plant felt empty. She used to bring me lunch on Saturdays when I had to work overtime, sit in my office while I finished up paperwork, tell me about her day at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. After she died, work became just work. I was ready to retire, spend time with my daughter Barbara, maybe do some fishing, travel to places Dorothy and I had talked about visiting. But then Leonard started circling like a shark smelling blood in the water. Leonard Walsh married my Barbara in 2020, right before Dorothy got sick. I should have paid more attention to the timing, but we were all focused on Dorothy's treatment, hoping the chemo would work, praying for more time. Leonard seemed like a good guy, handsome, well-dressed, had a steady job as a financial advisor. Barbara was 28 then, working as a retail manager, and she lit up around him. After watching her struggle through her mother's illness, I was just grateful to see her happy. Looking back, I realized Leonard timed his courtship perfectly. He swooped in when our family was vulnerable, when Barbara needed someone to lean on, when I was too distracted to ask the hard questions about his background, his finances, his real intentions. The trouble started about a month after the sale went through. We were having dinner at their house, nice place in Lincoln Park that I now know was mortgaged way beyond what Leonard could afford, when he brought up my portfolio management. Stanley, he said, using my first name like we were old buddies, you can't just let $5.8 million sit in savings accounts. Inflation will eat it alive. You need active management, strategic investments. I told him I had my own guy, Henry Klein, who'd been handling my investments for 20 years. Simple approach, nothing fancy, some mutual funds, some bonds, a few blue chip stocks, steady returns, no drama. Leonard leaned forward with that intense look he gets. Henry's old school, Stanley. He doesn't understand modern markets, cryptocurrency, tech stocks, international funds. That's where the real money is. I manage portfolios for clients with 10, 20 million. Let me show you what real wealth management looks like. I said I'd think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. But Leonard didn't let it drop. A week later, Barbara called me, her voice worried. Dad, Leonard thinks you're being too conservative with your money. He's really good at this stuff. His clients absolutely love him. I could hear the rehearsed quality in her voice, like she'd been coached on what to say. That should have been my first red flag. Then Leonard started showing up at my house more often, always with some new investment opportunity, some urgent market trend I was missing out on. He'd bring charts and projections, talk about cryptocurrency and hedge funds and offshore accounts. Made my head spin on purpose, I think. The more confused I looked, the more excited he got. That's when I started getting suspicious. See, 35 years running a manufacturing floor teaches you to read people. You learn to spot the guy who's cutting corners to make his numbers look good, the one who's padding his timesheet, the supervisor who's promising delivery dates he knows he can't meet. Leonard had that same desperate energy, like someone trying too hard to sell you something you don't need. During one of his visits, I noticed him looking around my house differently. Not like a son-in-law visiting family, but like an appraiser calculating values. He spent a lot of time asking about my insurance policies, my health, whether I'd updated my will recently, questions that felt intrusive, but he asked them with such apparent concern that it would have seemed ungrateful to object. "You should really think about estate planning, Stanley," he said one afternoon, settling into my favorite chair like he owned the place. "A man your age, with your assets, you need professional guidance. I know some excellent attorneys who specialize in this area." I told him I'd had the same lawyer for 15 years and was perfectly satisfied. But I watched his reaction, saw the flash of irritation before he covered it with that practiced smile. That night, I called my attorney, Howard Klein, Henry's brother and the smartest legal mind I know. "Howard," I said, "I need you to look into my son-in-law, quietly." Howard doesn't ask stupid questions. He just gets to work. He's been my attorney since I started having real money to protect, and I trust him completely. If I had concerns about Leonard, Howard would find out whether they were justified. 2 weeks later, he showed up at my house with a manila folder that changed everything. "Your instincts were right, Stanley," he said, spreading papers across my kitchen table. "Leonard Walsh isn't managing anybody's portfolio. He's running a Ponzi scheme." The documents told the whole ugly story. Leonard had maybe 8 clients total, all small-time investors who'd given him their retirement savings to manage. He was paying early investors with money from new ones, the classic pyramid setup that's been fooling people for over a century. His office was a mail drop. His wealth management firm was just a business license and a fancy website. And he was drowning in debt, $1.2 million in credit cards, personal loans, and a second mortgage on that Lincoln Park house that Barbara didn't even know about. "How long before it collapses?" I asked, studying the bank statements that showed Leonard juggling payments like a desperate carnival act. "Months, maybe weeks. His creditors are getting aggressive. Some of them aren't the type you want to owe money to." I felt sick to my stomach. My daughter had married a con man, and she had no idea. Worse, she was probably going to get hurt when his house of cards came crashing down. But Howard wasn't done. He pulled out another document, and his expression got even more serious. "His brother Eugene is part of this too. Eugene Walsh, supposedly a lawyer specializing in estate planning. But look at his recent cases. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Eugene specialized in guardianship proceedings, getting elderly people declared mentally incompetent so family members could control their assets. In the last 3 years, he'd handled 12 such cases. All involved wealthy seniors who mysteriously developed cognitive issues right around the time their families needed money. "They're not just after your money, Stanley," Howard said quietly. "They're planning to take control of you." That hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. They wanted to lock me up in some memory care facility while they systematically looted my accounts. And Barbara, sweet, trusting Barbara, would probably sign whatever they put in front of her, thinking it was for my own good. I stared at those papers for a long time, thinking about Dorothy and how she'd always been able to spot people's true character within minutes of meeting them. "That Leonard boy has hungry eyes," she'd said after their first dinner together, but then she got sick and we all got distracted. I looked up at Howard. "What do we do?" "We set a trap." The memorial dinner was my idea. Dorothy would have been 58 last Saturday, and I'd been planning something to honor her memory anyway. But Howard helped me see how this could be the perfect opportunity to find out what Leonard was really planning. Over the next few weeks, I started acting confused. Nothing dramatic at first, just forgetting names occasionally, repeating stories, misplacing my keys. I'd stare blankly at financial documents during family dinners, pretending I couldn't understand them anymore. "Dad, are you feeling okay?" Barbara asked one evening after I had told the same story about the plant twice in 1 hour. Her voice was thick with worry. "You seem distant lately." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, patting her hand while letting mine shake just slightly. "Just tired. Getting old, I guess. Sometimes I feel like my mind isn't as sharp as it used to be." I watched Leonard's reaction from across their dining room table. His eyes lit up like a kid seeing Christmas presents, but he covered it quickly with practiced concern. "Maybe you should see someone, Stanley," he said, leaning forward with that earnest expression he'd perfected. "There are excellent doctors who specialize in age-related memory issues. Early intervention can make a big difference." I nodded slowly, playing the part. "Maybe you're right. This is all so confusing." Howard helped me install hidden cameras in my house, just a few, in key spots where Leonard might feel comfortable talking freely. We monitored his phone calls when he visited, tracked his emails, built a case that could put him away for years. The breakthrough came 3 days before the memorial dinner, Leonard was in my study, the one room he thought I never used anymore, talking to his brother Eugene on speakerphone. I was supposedly napping upstairs, but I was actually in my bedroom watching the live feed on Howard's laptop. "Saturday night," Leonard said, his voice low and urgent. "The memorial dinner. Stanley will be emotional, vulnerable. I'll put the Rohypnol in his drink during the toast. He'll start acting confused, slurring his words. By the end of the night, everyone there will see him having a public breakdown." My hands clenched into fists as I watched him pace around my study like he already owned it. Then what? Eugene's voice came through the phone, tinny but clear. "We move fast. I've got the paperwork ready. Emergency guardianship petition. I'll file Monday morning citing the public incident. By Tuesday we'll have control of his accounts. I can start moving money immediately." "And Barbara?" Leonard laughed, a cold sound that made my blood run cold. "She'll do whatever I tell her. She always does. Once the old man is locked up in some facility, she won't have anyone else to turn to. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. What about the memorial dinner witnesses? That's the beauty of it. 200 people will see him lose it publicly. Slurring his words, acting paranoid, maybe even getting aggressive when the drug really kicks in. Perfect evidence for the competency hearing." Howard paused the recording and looked at me. "That's enough," he said. "We've got him cold." I shook my head. "Not yet. I want him to try it. I want to watch his face when his perfect plan destroys the wrong person." The memorial dinner was beautiful. Dorothy would have loved it. We held it at the Palmer House downtown, the same hotel where we'd celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white roses on every table, and a string quartet played the same songs Dorothy and I used to dance to in our living room on Saturday nights. I'd spent $25,000 on this party, and every penny was worth it. Not just because Dorothy deserved to be remembered in style, but because tonight Leonard was going to show 200 people exactly who he really was. The guest list read like a directory of my working life. Guys from the plant, suppliers I'd dealt with for decades, even the mayor's office sent a representative. Old friends, good people who'd known Dorothy, and respected what we'd built together. They were about to witness something that would stay with them forever. I sat at the head table, looking out at all those faces, and thought about Dorothy's favorite saying, "You can judge a man's character by how he treats people when he thinks no one is watching." Tonight, Leonard was going to fail that test spectacularly. Barbara looked beautiful in a navy blue dress Dorothy had helped her pick out years ago, back when she was still working retail and saving up for nicer clothes. But she looked tired too, older than her 32 years. I noticed how she kept glancing at Leonard for approval before she spoke or laughed. That should have been my first clue something was wrong, but I'd been so wrapped up in my own grief after Dorothy died that I missed the signs of my daughter's isolation. Leonard was holding court as usual, telling stories and charming the guests at our table. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to my bourbon glass. He was wearing his most expensive suit, probably the last time he'd get to wear it for a while, and that Rolex he claimed was a gift from a grateful client. Sitting next to Leonard was his brother Eugene, corporate lawyer, he claimed, though Howard's investigation had revealed his specialty in elder exploitation. Eugene was quieter than Leonard, but his eyes were always moving, always calculating. Tonight he looked nervous, fidgeting with his drink, checking his phone repeatedly. At 8:30, I stood up and tapped my wine glass. The feedback from the microphone cut through the conversation, and 200 faces turned toward me. "Friends," I said, my voice steady despite everything. "Thank you for coming tonight. Dorothy is watching, probably complaining that I spent too much on the flowers. That got the laugh I expected. 3 years ago, I lost my best friend, my partner, my anchor. Dorothy Morrison was the strongest person I ever knew. She worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse, came home and made dinner for her family, and still had energy to help Barbara with her homework, and listened to me complain about production schedules. I paused, looking at Barbara. She was crying softly, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Leonard had his hand on her shoulder, but he wasn't looking at her. He was watching me, waiting. Dorothy believed in the value of honest work, I continued. She believed in family, in loyalty, in protecting the people you love from those who would take advantage of them. She taught me that trust is something you earn, not something you're entitled to. I raised my glass to Dorothy Morrison, a woman who could spot a liar from across a room and wasn't afraid to say so. The room echoed the toast, and I watched Leonard carefully. He raised his glass, took a sip, then set it down. His hand moved across the table as everyone was drinking, smooth and practiced. Something went into my bourbon, clear liquid from a small vial he'd palmed expertly. He was good at this, I'll give him that. But I'd been watching him practice this move in my own house for months through hidden cameras. I finished my speech and excused myself to greet some old friends from the plant. As I moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting condolences, I kept Leonard in my peripheral vision. He was relaxed now, confident. He thought the hard part was over. He thought in 20 minutes I'd be stumbling over my words, making a fool of myself in front of everyone I respected. That's when I made my move. I came back to the table from behind, walking slowly like the aging widower everyone thought I was. The conversations were loud, people were laughing, no one was paying attention to one old man navigating through chairs and conversations. As I passed behind Leonard and Eugene, I stumbled, just a small stumble, the kind you might expect from a 58-year-old man who'd had an emotional evening. I caught myself on the back of Eugene's chair, and my hand swept across the table in what looked like an accident. The switch took less than 2 seconds. Leonard's drugged bourbon was now sitting in front of Eugene, and Eugene's clean whiskey was in front of me. "Sorry about that," I said, straightening up and patting Eugene on the shoulder with grandfatherly concern. "These old legs aren't what they used to be after a long day." Eugene barely looked up, just nodded absently and reached for his glass. The glass that had been sitting in front of me moments before. He took a long drink, then another. I sat down in my chair and raised my glass to my lips, pretending to drink the whiskey that was now safely in front of me. Across the table, Leonard was watching me with barely contained anticipation. He was checking his watch, calculating how long the Rohypnol would take to kick in, probably planning his performance as the concerned son-in-law who'd have to help his confused father-in-law home. I gave him nothing. I sat there perfectly steady, perfectly coherent, perfectly fine. His confident smile started to falter. And then Eugene made a strange sound. It started as a cough, then got worse. Eugene's hand went to his throat, his face draining of color like someone had opened a valve. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled under him. He grabbed the edge of the table, sending glasses and silverware crashing to the floor in a cascade of crystal and chaos. "Eugene!" Leonard shouted, jumping to his feet. "Eugene, what's wrong?" But Eugene couldn't answer. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the floor, his body jerking in violent spasms. The ballroom erupted into pandemonium, people screaming, waiters dropping trays, guests rushing forward to form a circle around Eugene's convulsing body. "Call 911!" someone yelled. "Give him space! Is there a doctor here?" I didn't move. I just sat in my chair watching the chaos unfold. And then I looked directly at Leonard. He wasn't looking at his brother writhing on the floor. He was staring at me with complete horror, his face white as chalk, his hands shaking like leaves in a windstorm. And in his eyes, I saw something I'd been waiting 4 months to see, pure, unfiltered fear. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes, impressive for downtown Chicago on a Saturday night. They worked on Eugene right there on the ballroom floor, stabilizing him before loading him onto a stretcher. The beautiful memorial dinner was over. Hotel, security ushered guests out while white roses lay trampled underfoot, and the string quartet packed up their instruments in stunned silence. I rode to Northwestern Memorial in my own car with Howard behind the wheel. "It worked," I said quietly, as we followed the ambulance through the city streets. Howard nodded but didn't smile. "We just watched a man nearly die, Stanley, even if he had it coming." The emergency room was a harsh contrast to the Palmer House elegance. Fluorescent lights, disinfectant smell, constant beeping of monitors. Leonard was pacing like a caged animal, while Barbara sat in a plastic chair, sobbing into her hands. I walked over and put my hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart." She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "Dad, what happened?" Eugene just collapsed. He was fine 1 minute and then... "I don't know, honey," I said, playing my role to the end. "I don't know." Leonard stopped pacing and fixed me with those calculating eyes. "You were sitting right there," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Did you see anything? Did Eugene eat something strange? Drink something he shouldn't have?" I shook my head slowly, letting my voice waver slightly. "I'm getting old, Leonard. I don't notice much these days." He studied my face for a long moment, and I could practically see his mind racing. He'd drugged my drink, watched me raise it to my lips. So, why was I standing here perfectly fine while his brother was fighting for his life in an emergency room? The doctor came out, a young woman with tired eyes and a serious expression. Family for Eugene Walsh? We all stood up. He's stable, she said. We pumped his stomach and got most of it out of his system, but I need to tell you what we found. His blood work came back positive for a significant dose of flunitrazepam. That's Rohypnol, commonly known as the date rape drug. In the amount we found, it would cause severe disorientation, memory loss, and in some cases, seizures like what Mr. Walsh experienced. Barbara gasped. Someone drugged him? At the party? Who would do such a thing? The doctor's expression was grim. I'm required by law to report this to police. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate poisoning. Leonard's face went from white to green. Sweat was beading on his forehead, despite the hospital's air conditioning. Of course, he managed to say. We'll cooperate fully with the investigation. The police arrived within an hour. 2 detectives who looked like they'd worked every kind of case Chicago had to offer. They interviewed each of us separately in a small consultation room that smelled like coffee and desperation. Leonard went first, walking into that room with what was left of his confident stride. He was in there for 50 minutes. When he came out, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. My turn was much shorter. I sat across from Detective Rodriguez and her partner, folded my hands on the table like a cooperative citizen, and waited. Mr. Morrison, she said, can you tell us what you observed tonight? I sighed like a tired widower. Not much, I'm afraid. My memory isn't what it used to be since my wife died. I was greeting guests, making small talk about the old days. Eugene was at the table when I came back from visiting with some friends from the plant, and a few minutes later, he collapsed. Did you see anyone near his drink? Anyone who might have had the opportunity to slip something into it? I shook my head. I'm sorry, Detective. There were so many people, so much going on. I just don't remember. Rodriguez studied me for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. We may have more questions later. Of course, I said. Anything to help find out who did this terrible thing. But we already had those answers. Howard and I had been building the case for months, and now we had Leonard on tape planning the whole thing. The investigation that followed was just confirming what we already knew. 3 days later, they arrested Leonard at his house. The recording of him planning to drug me was evidence enough, but Howard had also uncovered his Ponzi scheme, his massive debts, and the guardianship fraud he'd been planning with Eugene. When Barbara called me, sobbing, saying they had arrested her husband, I drove straight to her house. Come home, sweetheart, I said. We need to talk. That conversation was the hardest part of the whole ordeal. Sitting in my living room, showing my daughter the surveillance footage of her husband laughing about how he'd never loved her, how their entire marriage had been a con job to get to my money, watching her face as she realized that 4 years of her life had been built on lies. But Barbara is stronger than either Leonard or I gave her credit for. After the tears and the anger and the shock wore off, she got to work rebuilding her life. She moved back home for a few months, started therapy, filed for divorce, and began the long process of healing. The trials came 10 months later. Leonard got 8 years for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, attempted false imprisonment, and assault with a controlled substance. Eugene got 5 years and lost his law license. Both of them are currently guests of the Illinois Department of Corrections. I was in the courtroom for every verdict. Leonard looked at me as they led him away in handcuffs, his eyes full of hatred and disbelief. I just smiled back. Not because I was happy. There's no happiness in watching your family fall apart, but there was something that felt like justice. Today, Barbara works with me at the Morrison Foundation, the organization we started to help elderly people protect themselves from financial predators. We've helped dozens of families, prevented millions in theft, and put more than a few con artists behind bars. My name is Stanley Morrison. I'm 59 years old now. I learned that you're never too old to fight for what's right, never too trusting to verify what people tell. And never too set in your ways to start over when life demands it. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone destroy themselves with their own greed while you watch from a safe distance. The wolves are always hunting, but so are the rest of us. Never underestimate the power of patience and experience. While young predators rely on speed and charm, older wisdom wins through careful planning and letting enemies defeat themselves with their own greed. The greatest protection against family betrayal isn't suspicion, it's verification. Trust your instincts, but always gather evidence before you